Welcome to Nothing Is Real, a podcast about the Beatles. Everybody thinks they know the Beatles, but how much do we really know? My name is Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And we're live on tape from Dublin and Belfast. The Beatles have 14 days to record a brand new album before playing in front of a live UK audience. In this three-part episode of Nothing Is Real, we're going to cover Rubber Soul, because we've heard the story before, haven't we, Stephen?
We have. This seems to be a repeating story.
Rubber Soul is this rightfully acclaimed Beatles classic, and it gets this label which I'm not totally convinced about, that it's their first classic album. And I think there's a couple of reasons why that's true and a couple of reasons why it kind of happens by accident, and we'll talk about that. But what is certainly true as we look through this story of Rubber Soul is that nothing was particularly planned.
Sound familiar?
And it happens very, very fast. It does sound familiar. And I mean, you know, we're now in the Beatles post-Get Back universe. And of course, they had every reason to assume they could pull something out of thin air in 2 or 3 weeks, because that is what they had done throughout their career.
This is the thing. This is what they did. They worked best under pressure. And I mean, I think it's mentioned several times during Get Back. You know, the best things we do aren't planned, just like us. When
our backs are against the wall, etc., etc.,
etc.
Yes. Yeah, but obviously at this point in time, which is the end of 1965, the motivations and the interband feelings and obviously the supervision from Mr. Epstein are all quite different.
Yes, so they're coming off the back of a tour. They have a short period. They have to get a Christmas album. They have to get a Christmas single. And then they're going to go off and start touring again. So they're still on that treadmill. If you look at the album that came before this, we did an episode on Help, and we sort of commented that this is a bit of a transitional album, Help, where they're sort of a bit of a mishmash, and this is a different thing that emerges from these sessions. But going in, I'm not sure that certainly the public were not necessarily expecting it to be anything different.
Well, I know, like our very first episode way back, and I think it was 1987 we did our first episode, was on the Help album. Right, yeah. And I, if memory serves, I said something rather controversial, which is I prefer the Help album to Rubber Soul. And I don't think I would put Rubber Soul in my top 5 Beatles albums. Now, I know saying something is in your bottom half Beatles album, it's still preferable to thousands of other albums. But I think I prefer Help to Rubber Soul. I certainly don't think Rubber Soul is in my top 5.
Frankly, I'm surprised this podcast has lasted as long as it can. With that,
is it in your top 5?
With that type of deliberately provocative take.
Oh, you know me, I just like to stir it up a little bit.
Yeah,
I think there's a couple of things that let Rubber Soul. It's just I don't know. Well, we can tease this out as we go along. You obviously disagree. I
do disagree. I think there's a maturity in the songwriting. I think, you know, George is starting to come into his own. So what's not to love? Yeah, I just think it ushers in a new it's a new phase Beatles album, if you will.
It is a new phase Beatles album. Jeez, everything is Get Back now when you look at it. There's this notion that the Beatles across their lifespan were kind of 3 different bands. You know, they were kind of the first 3 years, the intermediate 3 years, and then the last kind of 3 years ish, 2.5, 3 years. And as you say, this is kind of the end of that first period of Beatles that kind of takes you from Please Please Me, and then, you know, you kind of phase 2, this album kind of straddles, you know, if you talk, say, Rubber Soul up until the end of Magical Mystery Tour, and then there's kind of 68, 69, 70 is kind of the last phase. So this is, as you say, a transitional album, and there's a lot of things that are changing at this time. And I suppose one of the things is lots of tea, you know, lots of tea, that Bob Dylan introduced them to tea.
Exactly. Well, this is something that Ringo, of all people, has a quote where he says, "Grass was really influential in a lot of our changes, especially with the writers." And this is like interesting that he talks about the other 3 as the writers. And because they were writing different material, we were playing differently, we were expanding in all areas of our lives, opening up to a lot of different attitudes. I feel we made it on love songs. Now we get to Rubber Soul and begin stretching the writing and the playing a lot more. That was the departure record. A lot of other influences were coming down and going on the record. And I think that's clearly the case, that there are other bands have come into the picture. We touched on this in the Help episode, I think. You had the Stones were emerging, the Byrds were emerging, Bob Dylan was emerging. The charts were full of potential rivals, and the Help album, I think, they were slightly behind the curve at that point. I think that's what we concluded, despite your arguing to the contrary. There is a rivalry here that I think they need to kind of respond to, and the Dynamite Wade.
I think that's a good point. And I mean, we've also, it's funny that we're only getting onto Rubber Soul now, because we've also talked about Beatles for Sale in the past. And I think Beatles for Sale and Help, still has the retro, covers. And Rubber Soul, I think, is potentially the first Beatles album where they are influenced by stuff that is happening that's not, pre-Beatles or rock and roll era. It's the first time you can actually see a full-on contemporary influence. There's a bit of it on Help. You've Got a Hide Your Love Away is a bit Dylan-esque, but this album, as you say, you can point to bits of it and say Dylan. You can point to other bits of it and say, oh yeah, the Byrds, and the Byrds are brand new at that point. They've only come around just a few months earlier. So this is an album where things are starting to get a bit more circular, where they've influenced the world is influencing them back, and now you can see it all going through its own kind of lens, its own kind of circuit.
I think that's right, and I think the big thing is they are very aware of this. So it seems to me this is the point at which they start to realize they are influencing other people. They are actually having an effect beyond the screaming girls at the Adelphi or wherever. That there is a wider import to what they're doing, and I suppose maybe some of that in particular comes from Paul, who's doing his Man About Town, soaking up culture like a sponge act, but also the fact, as you say, they're also interacting with other groups. They meet the Byrds in 1965, they go to a session, they're very aware of the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys are developing beyond the sort of surf and cars and girls of their early songs. So I think there is this awareness of the wider cultural impact of what they're doing. Plus, I genuinely think you can't underestimate the fact that this is George starting to develop as a songwriter.
Well, yeah, you've a quote here from George. She says, songwriting at the time of Rubber Soul for me was a bit frightening, because John and Paul had been writing since they were 3 years old. It was hard to come in suddenly and write songs. They had a lot of practice. They'd written most of their bad songs before we'd even gotten to a recording studio. I had to come from nowhere and start writing and have something with at least enough quality to put on the record alongside all the wondrous hits. It was very hard. I like that, wondrous hits. I certainly do think that Rubber Soul, George's songs are, for the first time, oh, that's who this guy is,
I think so. He starts to develop a personality, I think, as a songwriter, and but I think that's a very important point that he makes, is that he had to make his mistakes or write his early subpar songs in public, and none of his songs are as terrible as I've Lost My Little Girl or Thinking of Lincoln, or they got all those out of the way. He had to come. Don't Bother Me is a decent song, but this is
you've put Thinking of Lincoln in my head now. Okay, that's my earworm for the day. It's a great song.
Great song. So yeah, it's still part of Paul's set to this very day. No, it's not. So I think George's appearance as a songwriter is here. His character is starting to emerge.
So if we have a little look at the timeline, there's lots of things going on here. As we say, there's the writing, there's the production, there's kind of the experience of the four Beatles, there's the drugs, there's the trousers, there's everything. It kind of comes to a head in Rubber Soul. And if we kind of look at the timeline backwards, the album comes out on December the 3rd, 1965 in the UK. The US version comes out 3 days later on December the 6th in the USA. And if you've got an album that is coming out on December the 3rd, obviously you should start recording it on October the 12th, less than 2 months earlier.
Yes.
But even before that, there are from October the 12th, there are 15 sessions, 14 for Rubber Soul and 1 for We Can Work It Out, the single that comes out at the same time with the Day Tripper, to get that done from October the 12th. But the actual start of Rubber Soul if we rewind back a little bit, is there's like a session 0 back in June 17th, 1965, when they're trying to bring the Help album into land, and they record Wait.
So if we go back to those Help sessions again, they're struggling to fill the quota of 14 songs that they need for this album. So this is the 17th of June 1965, and this is when they redo the vocal for Yesterday, and they record the strings for Yesterday as well. Ringo does Act Naturally, your favourite Ringo song. Yes.
Well, I don't know. It has competition on Rubber Soul.
This song they recorded from scratch in 90 minutes. The second took even longer. But then they do 4 takes of what is essentially the rhythm track for Wait, and take 4 is the best. And this is a fully realized backing track. And then there are vocals done, just single tracked vocals, and that was it. And they actually make mono mixes the next day of Wait. So at that stage, it was presumably slated for the Help album. No reason why it shouldn't be on the Help album. But then when they do the stereo mixes, they exclude Wait. I mean, I think the assumption here is that George Martin didn't feel it was good enough to include on the album. So what they did was they just, 10th of May, they knocked off versions of Dizzy Miss Lizzy.
And we did say this back in the Help episode that, Help would be a totally different beast if it had been all original material, As a Hard Day's Night. I think the covers kind of let it down a little bit. But what we'll see with this album, and also with Rubber Soul, is that George Martin is still making some key decisions in terms of the Beatles aren't necessarily getting involved in mixing yet, and they're not getting involved in track listing or any of those kind of things. Whereas that's still an executive decision that's being made by George Martin. So he decides that Wait would be better off with a rock and roll cover. And I guess that had been the practice in albums at the time, which is, something that's popular in a live set, something new, something forgotten, a bit of a cover. So that's forgivable. But I think in retrospect, it wasn't the right decision.
No. And, if they'd ended Help with Wait and then Yesterday. Yeah. But you can't add, again, the rule is you can't end an album on a downbeat song.
What, the Beatles can't, or
well, I think
generally anyone can't generally.
Well, certainly the Beatles. They don't end albums on downbeat songs at this point.
I'm just running through them in my head. I suppose not. No. If I wanted to hear this June 17th, 1965 version of Wait, where could I hear it?
Well, what you do is you just play the left channel on the original stereo mix. And that's it. Pretty much.
And so everything on the right channel is added, because
that's more or less the way it works down. Yeah.
So Wait, actually, what we'll see is it kind of bookends the Rubber Soul session. So it's recorded back in June 65 for Help. It's put on the shelf. And when they're running out of time towards the end, as we'll see later on, it gets dusted down. So it's pretty much more or less almost the first and last thing recorded for the album. But at this stage, they've no idea that it's going to end up on an album called Rubber Soul that comes out in December 1965. It's just one of the odd collection of, there's an odd collection of Beatles songs and remakes that stay on the shelf in 1965. They're starting to, tease out some of that stuff. So before the Rubber Soul sessions start in earnest, which, as we said, is Tuesday, October the 12th, they go off on tour in summer 65. They play big dates in the US and Shea Stadium and all the rest. And live, they're still doing a very traditional type of set list.
They are. If you look at the set list, and this is the tour on which the part of the Hollywood Bowl album from 1977, some of the tracks turn up. But so the set list is Twist and Shout, She's a Woman, I Feel Fine, Dizzy Miss Lizzy, Ticket to Ride, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Can't Buy Me Love, Babies in Black, terrible song, I Want to Be Your Man, Hard Day's Night, Help, and I'm Down. So, those are a lot of pretty old songs, and really not reflective of what is about to come.
Yes, and it's funny, we say old songs, but they're only a year or two old. Like most bands would be touring their stuff for a year or two. But in the Beatles universe, it is certainly kind of old. And the other thing to remember is that the Help album itself, comes out on the 6th of August, 1965. There's only about 16 weeks or so that separates Help coming out and being in the stores and Rubber Soul. And, it goes back to Epstein's deal that, the Beatles should have 2 albums and 4 singles out per year. And Rubber Soul is kind of the last time, Rubber Soul and We Can Work It Out Day Tripper is the last time that they managed to more or less meet that quota. But yeah, it's like a 4-month gap between the two albums.
Only we have a higher work rate.
Do we though? I don't know. So they're coming off the back of that US tour. They've got about September to try and get their material together. And John and Paul are having writing sessions, as we'll see, mainly out in John's house. It seems to be more Paul goes out to John and wakes him up and tells him to finish a song. Then John is knocking on Paul's door in London. You'd think John had come to London. I don't know. Just maybe John was hanging out with the family. I don't know.
Well, and the thing is, they are still writing together, not in the same way as that eyeball to eyeball, but you know, Paul is sending John reel-to-reel tapes of little demos and things like that, and you know, John is then working on lyrics or middle eights, or Paul rather on the middle eights for John's songs. So they're still collaborating, but not in the same way. It's that the songwriting process is altering.
Yes, but yeah, there's still an awful lot of John and Paul together on this. And just before the Beatles go into the studio to start Rubber Soul proper, John Lennon turns 25 years of age on the 9th of October, 1965. Do you have any idea where they celebrated John Lennon's 25th birthday?
I do not know where this was celebrated.
They were at a big party in Lionel Bart's house.
Lovely.
And they had a separate celebration afterwards themselves, but they were in Lionel Bart's house because there was a Lionel Bart musical opening called Twang, which was one of his musicals that's not particularly well loved or remembered. But Lionel Bart was pretty much, as I understand it, his house was a party house in the 60s.
Much like your own house.
No.
This isn't where Judy Garland turned up. Was this a different party where she suddenly turns up? Well, that was at Epstein's house.
Oh,
but
that was at Epstein's house.
But you can see this is obviously Epstein's influence. You know, Lionel Bart. It's an odd insight into the kind of crazy worlds they were moving between.
Yes, and the very artistic world that they were in. You know.
Yeah.
So when we get to, but there is this deadline. So they are told, hey, you know, you had an album out in August. 1 month has passed. You now need to get another album done before Christmas for the Christmas market. And they are not in the business of, we're going to revolutionize the album as an art statement. They're basically in the business of how many songs can we get down as quickly as possible. And so the first Rubber Soul session proper is on Tuesday, October the 12th. And I'm always curious in what the first song recorded for the album is, because you can see certainly on later albums, they kind of act as a template for what's about to happen. So Revolver's first song is Tomorrow Never Knows. Pepper's first song is Strawberry Fields. The White Album's first song is Revolution, very much John steering the ship and giving an idea of what's about to happen. For the first session, there's 2 songs recorded, and they're kind of the yin and the yang of Lennon, which is Run for Your Life and Norwegian Wood, which are 2, once again, Lennon leading the charge as to, you know, putting down the first step on the album, but 2 very different songs.
Yeah, it's always John songs that get looked at first, I think. Run for Your Life is a song that a lot of people don't like.
I'm one of them.
Oh, here we go. Well, you and John Lennon, don't like this song. I think the song is great. And I'm surprised that you don't like the song, because it seems to me that this is the template. The sound here is the template for the Monkees' entire career.
Yes, I can see where you're coming from with that. I guess the reason why I am set against Run for Your Life is when I first encountered it, I think it's an odd album closer. I think, you know, when I first listened to Rubber Soul, I guess I would have been 14 or so, and you're told, oh, this is the famous Rubber Soul. And it's you're kind of going through it, and, you know, it's got great songs in it. And then he gets to this song at the end, and it's a bit like the Dizzy Miss Lizzy phenomenon. It's like, well, this appears very throwaway. And, you know, having had a very proto-hippie experience throughout some of the other songs, we're now back to I'd rather see a dead little girl. And I understand that that's it's an Elvis reference, and it's a bit of a blues trope, and, you know, it's also I'd rather be dead and all the rest. You know, I get that, but coming after what it is, I think it's a bit of a mood breaker, and I don't really care for it, you know.
But what I like about it are just, I like the sound of it. I like the musical sound of it. I like all the guitars that are going around. You know, there's a lot of guitar overdubs there. But you see what I mean? It's a kind of like Last Train to Clarksville kind of
No, I do get
jangly vibe. And people, you know, bang on about the misogynistic aspect of it. But it's no more. I mean, is it worse than Under My Thumb? Or Ballad in Plain D, any Bob Dylan or Stone song from the era, you know, Yesterday's Papers and things like that. It's you know, it's not to be taken literally. I think it's somebody venting their frustration, and as you say, it's a kind of an old blues trope.
Yes, yeah. No, I think. Look, if you're looking for misogyny, definitely it's the Stones you're looking at. I think I don't think it's something that fits the Beatles particularly well, you know. So as a one-off song, fair enough. But it's what's curious about the fact that it's these two songs, Run for Your Life and Norwegian Wood, is that they're two sides of Lennon. So it's almost like one is early Elvis Lennon and the other one is modern Dylan Lennon.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at Run for Your Life, this is, you know, the Elvis song we're talking about is Baby Let's Play House, which is, you know, has a line, I'd rather see a dead little girl than to be with another man. That's where it comes from. And again, it's the same as the whole Come Together vibe, where he's basically taking a line from a song and going, nobody's going to notice. It's all absolutely fine. And we don't think he got sued for Run for Your Life at all.
No, he didn't get sued for Run for Your Life, but he seems to think it is. I mean, he actually said in 1980, I wrote it around that line, a line from an old blues song that Elvis Presley did. But it isn't an old blues song. It's a song that was written in 1955. So it's not a sort of, you know, trad arranged by... it was written by a guy called Arthur Gunter, and it was Elvis's fourth single. It was the first song that made the national chart for Elvis. But Arthur Gunter is a fascinating character. He has a great compilation of albums on Excello, and he got a $6,500 royalty check, supposedly from Elvis. But the best thing, he continued to record for Excello until 1961. His band broke up, but you think this is going to be a sort of terrible story of you know, like other blues artists, that they are ripped off and they sort of die in penury and all the rest of it. He kept going, but he retired in 1973 because he won the Michigan State Lottery.
That's nice.
There's a movie right there.
Unfortunately, he died about 3 years later. He was only 49 when he died after winning the lottery, so you can't have it all.
Boy, those last 3 years, you know.
What a time he had. Paul suggests that in many years from now that the song was largely John's. You don't say, Paul.
He's distancing himself from this one.
But he does say things like, Paul says, John was always on the run. He was married, whereas none of my songs would have said, catch you with another man. It was never a concern of mine because I had a girlfriend and I would go with other girls. It was a perfectly open relationship. So I wasn't as worried about that as John was. Bit of a macho song. Was it an open relationship, Paul? Did everyone know it was an open relationship?
And here we have Jane Asher on the podcast who's going to come and tell us if that was... I mean, that is such...
That's news to her.
It's, you know, John was always on the run. It was never, catch you with another man was never a concern of mine because, you know, I was the cute one. And I had an open relationship. There's a lot of revisionism there. Do you not think, in sort of justification?
Oh, I think so. You know, I'm surprised he even thinks about it at all. And
John made a couple of comments. In 1970, he said the song was always a favourite of George's. And then in 1980, he said it was a favourite to George. And you think, well, what does that mean? It was a favourite of George's, or it was written as a favour to George? And is that like a misprint or a mistranscription or something? But does he mean it was deliberately written?
I think one of those is I think one of those is a misunderstanding. Let's say a favourite of George's, maybe.
Favourite of
Must
George's,
have liked playing it.
Yeah, I think because there's a lot of guitars. There's sort of 4 overdubbed guitar tracks there, and that's why, you know, I don't even object particularly to the lyric, but I do like the guitar sound there, and it's slightly ragged, and I quite like that as well.
Yeah, no, I get that. I'll go back and listen again with and I'll try and, you know, try and imagine I don't understand the lyrics. But it's, it is a good sound. And it does pop up, again, all roads lead back to Get Back, Let It Be. It does pop up on January the 21st, 1969, when they start singing a little bit of it.
They do. What I would say is I've heard a bootleg recording of this. John at this point had taken to having a reel-to-reel tape recorder in the studio with him, and then he would tape the monitor mixes. So when they were listening to it back, he would tape that. And there is a tape that he made, but of course what he did was he taped over the demo. So all the demos from this era tend to be on reel-to-reel tapes. There's lots of these reel-to-reel tapes have emerged where John has re-recorded stuff over the top of the demo, so you just get like 10 seconds of the demo. And you think, John.
Well, I think isn't that an important thing about an artist, is that they're not too precious about some of that stuff, that you have to know when to wipe and move on. Yes, well, I've erased all the old episodes of Nothing Is Real.
Very good, very good. All the rehearsal tapes. Just very quickly, the mono mix is slightly longer than the stereo mix, and the 1987 mix that George Martin did, because he redid the stereo mix of Rubber Soul because he didn't like it in 1987, is shorter again. So there's 3 different versions circulating before we can get on to the remastered version.
Yeah, when we do kind of talk a little bit about the mixing, as you say, there's a mono mix, a stereo mix, but the stereo mix disappeared in the mid-80s when the CDs came out. George Martin did a very quick stereo remix, which some people argue about. The original stereo mix is available on the mono CD box set from 2009.
That's right.
If that's not too confusing a statement.
It's very panned left and right. It's just like a complete separation, and that's why you can almost sort of just listen to instrumental versions of the songs if you turn down one side.
There's a very funny video on YouTube about what it's like to listen to the Beatles with one headphone, and it's all just random noises. The rhythm track for this, they only did one take that was complete, which was take 5. John on acoustic guitar and guide vocals, Paul on bass, George on electric rhythm guitar, Ringo on new Ludwig drums, and then multiple lead guitar overdubs from George and Ringo's tambourine, and then all the vocals on top of that. So, pretty solid bit of work. But the other thing that gets recorded that day is Norwegian Wood, open brackets, This Bird Has Flown, close brackets. And there's a certain, as I kind of said, there's a bit of, John as Mr. Ben, the children's character, who I'm sure many listeners won't know what I'm talking about, but he tries on a different costume. So he's tried on his Elvis costume.
I see what
and
you're
now
doing.
He's putting on his, now he's putting on his Bob Dylan costume. And maybe it's my own snobbery that I prefer the Dylan costume to the Elvis costume. But if we're kind of looking for something along the lines of Tomorrow Never Knows or Revolution to say, what's the current style or mindset for this record, Norwegian Wood delivers that.
Yes, I think so. It's I suppose the quintessential Rubber Soul track. I always think of a distinction between Rubber Soul and Revolver. George famously in Anthology couldn't remember which came first or where one started and one began.
Yes.
But they sound completely different. And I think Rubber Soul has a sort of organic, sort of a woody sound, as Monty Python would say.
Yes, it's not tinny. Run for Your Life is tinny.
Run for Your Life is tinny. And Revolver is a very tinny, metallic sound. Whereas the overriding feel is sort of, even down to the cover, I think, is that kind of earthy, woody, organic sound. And I think Norwegian Wood is the quintessential song. If you could only pick one song off Rubber Soul to take to the desert island, this is the one I'd take.
Well, and I think if I could pick one song that's about George Martin's broken foot, I think it'd be this one.
Yes. It's quite the inspiration. Do you want to explain that before people turn off?
Well, apparently they were on holidays. The Lennons were on holidays with the Martins at the end of January 1965. And George Martin had a broken foot. They were in the Swiss Alps skiing, and there was obviously some kind of accident. And so he would play a little ditty to George Martin, who was sitting around with his broken foot, and had to do with nursing his injured foot, his injured toe. And that's the song that evolved into Norwegian Wood.
It seems very strange to me that the Lennons went on holiday with the Martins. You think they would be a very different couple,
But there is, pre-India. India seems to put an end to them traveling in any sorts of groups anymore.
Yeah.
But they who else do they travel with? It's kind of...
No, but what I mean is I could see Paul and Jane going on holiday with George Martin and his wife.
Yeah.
But John, who by this stage is, dropping acid and recording weird stuff in the roof space of his house in his little music room, it just seems odd.
But he's still trying to be normal, John. He's still trying to be Mr. Suburban Husband type person. He hasn't totally reneged on that yet.
I suppose so. But John said he didn't. He says he wrote this at Kenwood. So he was saying that in 1970. In 1972, he said, "Paul helped me on the lyric." And this is something that we notice across the whole of Rubber Soul is how they write together, and one of them provides the start and the other comes in and finishes it off. So Paul, in many years from now, says, I came in and he had the first stanza, which was brilliant. I once had a girl, or should I say she once had me. That was all he had, no title, no nothing. And I said, right, okay. And it sort of wrote itself. Once you've got a great idea, they do tend to write themselves, providing you know how to write songs. That's an important proviso. So I picked it up at the second verse. So Paul is sort of saying he had quite the input there.
I do like that sentiment, providing you know how to write songs. And he has said versions of that kind of thing over the years, but I know it's an understatement to say, well, he does know how to write songs. Yeah. But he's a guy who is quite adept at being able to take an idea and imagine where it goes, or think about where it goes, or to think around corners. And so, many writers say that the fun is actually in the rewriting. So for Paul, who's a great songwriter, to actually, come in and to be given the seed of an idea instead of having to come up with the idea himself, well, that's just manna from heaven. As long as you've got a collaborator who you think is good enough, and he obviously did with Lennon. So he that's perfect for him. But I do like that notion, providing you know how to write songs. That he's pretty confident at this point that he knows how to write a song.
He's written a couple before.
well, he sees it, but he does see it as a process, and I think John might still see it as a, there's this notion of, and again, it is shown in the Get Back film that, sometimes you have to mine things. Not everything is an immediate inspiration. They don't all arrive fully formed. And Paul is not averse to the mining or the mathematics that goes into figuring out how to write a song. Whereas maybe John is a bit more, he's very much into the kernel of the inspiration of the song.
I think that's right. And I think increasingly over the next kind of 6-7 years, Lennon just becomes about, well, you just grab the first idea, and the first idea is the best idea. Paul's not averse to that. I think Paul, maybe later in his career, gets to that point where he doesn't think about rewriting lyrics, or he just goes with the first draft. And, I'm thinking puppy dogs' tails and things like that. Whereas if you put more effort into it. But this song, John has always been very specific that this was him writing about an affair that he was having.
Yes.
But in such a way that he didn't want to let his wife know that he was having an affair. So he actually says, I was sort of writing from my experiences, girls' flats, things like that. And then he's more specific in 1980, where he said it was about an affair I was having. I was very careful and paranoid because I didn't want my wife Sin to know that there really was something going on outside the household. I'd always had some kind of affairs going, so I was trying to be sophisticated, but in such a smokescreen way that you couldn't tell. I can't remember any specific woman it had to do with.
I hate to break it to John, but I bet Cynthia knew.
I would say, although she did, she does profess to have been shocked when he at one point,
really,
later on, kind of he sort of lists all of the affairs that he's had. But so the question is, who is this song actually about? Is it about somebody specific? He says he can't remember. Pete Shotton says it was a song about John's affair with a, quote, sophisticated female journalist,
which could be maybe the late Maureen Cleave,
maybe. But Philip Norman, who is usually wrong about everything, says the song is actually about John's affair with Sunny Freeman, the wife of Robert Freeman, the photographer. And apparently she used to describe herself as Norwegian, and their apartment was decorated with wood paneling. It's all about the wood paneling.
Well, John doesn't know, or said in 1980, he didn't know exactly what Norwegian wood came from. Paul says that, he said Norwegian wood was really cheap pine, which people were decorating with at the time, but it's not a good title, cheap pine. So it's a little parody on the kind of girls who do their flat where there'd be a lot of Norwegian wood. It was completely imaginary from my point of view, but in John's head, it was based on an affair that he had. This wasn't the decor of someone's house. We made that up. And it's also, Paul also says in many years from now, it's like one of their joke songs, which it's not a great joke, but where's the joke in it?
Well, do you not think it's funny? I think it's a funny song. It's, he picks up this girl, goes back to her flat, thinks he's on to a sure thing, and then she said, sorry, I have to work in the morning. So then he has to sleep in the bath, which is kind of quite funny. That's a kind of, sitcom trope. And then she goes off to work, and then I lit a fire. Does he burn the house down? Does he burn the flat down? So that's, it's like a little sitcom in itself.
Well, that's what Paul said. I had the idea to set the place on fire, so I take some sort of credit. But it never really dawned on me that he was setting the apartment on fire until I read Paul say that. I just thought, oh, he lit a fire. He's on his own and he's lighting a fire to stay warm. I didn't realize that the hilarious joke was that
I lit a fire
because he was turned down. He became an arsonist.
Yeah, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. He burns the flat down.
The song is very much the opposite of Run for Your Life. It's funny how in Run for Your Life, it's like, I'd rather see you dead than to be with another man. And then the other song is, I hope my wife doesn't find out I'm having an affair. Oh my God, I'm going to be in so much trouble. It doesn't really make much sense.
As you say, this is the two sides of John Lennon. And the other thing is, it's a sort of waltz. Yeah.
It's an odd time signature.
John, you will recall in Get Back, is very scathing about I Me Mine, saying this band doesn't play waltzes. You think, well, you kind of do, John, but there you go.
The song is also noticeable because George takes a sitar break. But before we talk about that, why don't we take our own break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
End of part one. Intermission. End of intermission. Part two.
Welcome back. So when we think of Norwegian wood, we think of sitars. The version that they record this first night of recording is done in a single take. And George breaks out his sitar. This is the dawning of George as a sitarist.
This is the take that will turn up on Anthology 2 in a sort of Jeff Emmerich mix. And I think I'm right in saying that the lyric is slightly switched. Drinking my wine, biding my time becomes biding my time, drinking her wine. It's kind of switched, but otherwise the song is completely there. John doesn't like this arrangement at all, and if you listen to Anthology 2, it is a bit clunky, and George's the sitar part is odd. It's just very literal. It's just kind of following the melody, and it's not really adding anything. It sort of detracts. I would much rather hear this version with the sitar mixed out, I think, as just an acoustic Dylan run through. I think it might work that way. I don't think the sitar works at all on version 1.
Yeah, and in a sort of some kind of prediction of how the Beatles are going to work in the future. What actually happens, as you say, is that this version of Norwegian Wood gets put on the shelf. And if we skip ahead briefly to October the 21st, 65, they decide to do another version of Norwegian Wood from scratch. So some of the versions are still the same. Some of the elements are still the same, the acoustic guitar, the sitar, but it's basically a question of trying to nail the mood. So it's a 4.5-hour session on October the 21st from 2:30 to towards 7 in the evening. And the song has changed its title because it had essentially been This Bird Has Flown, but now it gets tipped over officially into Norwegian Wood. And take 4 is kind of the keeper, as John says, I showed you on the tape. And so they have a basic rhythm track of 2 acoustic guitars, bass guitar, bass drum beats, and vocals. And then they do overdubs, and then in comes George with a much more coherent sitar part.
Yeah, I mean, you get the sense he's worked out what he's doing, and it's an ingredient in the song rather than being played all the way through, and it's a more sort of complementary feel to it.
Well, I think in the first version, he's playing it like a guitarist. He's trying to find a melody line and he's picking out the notes, bang, bang, bang. Whereas in the second version, he's introducing the drone of the sitar, which is obviously the whole point of a sitar, which is, that kind of the ambience of the instrument as opposed to just the melodic part. And famously, obviously, George first encounters a guitar just a few months earlier on the set of Help in the Indian restaurant scene. From such little acorns do big things grow.
Yeah, it's slightly problematic in the 21st century Indian restaurant scene. But
there's a couple of problematic issues. We're not cancelling Help.
We're not cancelling Help,
but
no.
No.
I watched it recently. It's quite funny. It's funny. It's very much of its time. It's a bit of a lark. The colours are of its time. The themes are of its time. But but yeah, he said. It was sort of fairly spontaneous. He picked it up. He was sort of fooling around with it. Ringo describes this as such a mind blower. We had this strange instrument on the record. We were all open to anything when George introduced the sitar. You could walk in with an elephant as long as it was going to make a musical note. I'd like to see that. That's more Brian Wilson, I think he's thinking of.
It didn't take much to blow minds in 1965. It's a sitar,
anything was viable.
From India. Yeah.
John is kind of saying in 1980, it's the first pop song that ever had a sitar on it. I asked George to play this guitar lick on the sitar. He wasn't sure whether he could play it yet because he hadn't done much on the sitar, but he was willing to have a go, as is his wont, and he learnt the bit. And you think, so John is taking credit for the idea, but also he's very, it's like Ticket to Ride is the first heavy metal song. This is the first song with a sitar on it. I Feel Fine is the first record with feedback. John's very much about claiming the firsts here.
Well, let's not forget that the US Help soundtrack has a sitar on it, which you stated before. And also, a single that came out during the summer of 65 is the Kinks' See My Friends, which was recorded in May 65 and came out in July 65. And although it doesn't have a sitar on it, it does have a kind of a tambura-style drone running through it. So it's certainly something that was in the pop music ether at the time.
Yes. And the engineer, Norman Hurricane Smith, he comments that this is extremely difficult to record because it's lots of peaks and a very complex waveform. And, he seems to have had quite a difficult time recording that. And the thing that really shocked me is he says he didn't like Rubber Soul. I thought he was the engineer on Rubber Soul, and he, much like yourself, he doesn't like it.
Well, he said it wasn't really my bag, but then, he's a fascinating guy, Normal Hurricane Smith, because he goes off to work with Pink Floyd and the Pretty Things on SF Sorrow. And then he becomes Hurricane Smith, the artist, and he has two kind of freak hits, Don't Let It Die in the UK in 1971 and a number one in the US in 1972, Oh Babe, What Would You Say? And he appears on The Tonight Show. And it must have been wild for Lennon, in New York, kind of watching Norman Hurricane Smith appear on TV shows, because he would have been at that stage late 40s.
I was going to say he'd been 103 at that point.
Turning up on US TV and being number one of the pop charts. It's a nice twist, I guess.
Yeah, and apparently John also used to call him 2 Decibel Smith because he kept telling them to turn things down.
So they managed to get Norwegian Wood done in this second version, and there's a couple of different. There's a mono stereo mix difference, isn't there?
There is. There's a kind of weird, and this is just increasingly the case. I mean, you could spend the rest of your life chasing down these different mixes, but on the mono mix, they don't fade down the sitar track when he's not playing, so you can actually hear George coughing. And then what seems to possibly be John saying, "Oh, sounds good." So they just don't pay attention to this. The stereo mix is different, but you can still hear sort of voices in the background. So if you listen with headphones, you can kind of hear these versions. And then, of course, it turns up again at Twickenham, the 7th and the 9th of January.
Yes,
everything turns up in Twickenham.
I think from now on we say, and does it turn up during the Get Back sessions? Yes or no? And it's a yes. It turns up on January the 7th and the 9th during the rehearsals there. when we get to, so the first full day proper is Tuesday, October the 12th. Second full day proper is Wednesday, October the 13th. Session number 2, Paul's debut song, and Paul brings in Drive My Car, which is, that's a pretty solid Beatles song. It's the song that opens the album. It's a song that pretty much has been in an awful lot of his live sets to this date. And it's another one of these songs that was written by John and Paul together.
But you don't like this song much.
No, it's not that I don't like it.
You said,
no.
You definitely told me off air that you didn't like this song.
No, it's not that I don't like it.
You don't love it. You don't love it.
I don't totally love it. I think there's a couple of moments on Rubber Soul where I think there's a little bit of detachment going on, and Drive My Car is a little bit kind of clever in a way, maybe. Like, it grooves and it sounds fantastic, and the cowbell is amazing and all that kind of stuff. And again, it's all relative in the Beatles universe because all of it's fantastic. But I'm just saying, if I had to choose, where would it all go?
Fair enough. Nicely done. If what I would say is, I would give this song, if you want to know the difference between Ringo and other drummers, this is the song to listen to. There's a version of this song on Paul Is Live, which is terrible, and it's all I think about the drumming, and it's just that kind of indefinable feel. So if you play the two things, all the elements are there in each song, but it's just really flat and lifeless, and it might be to do with the live sound recording, but I think it's to do with the with the drumming and the feel. But
listen, you can't underestimate what Ringo brought to everything. But it was another one of these ones that kind of came in the Kenwood sessions sometime in the weeks before Rubber Soul, where again, maybe a lot of people listening here will know the story that Paul had this song called Diamond Rings that, he had, I can give you diamond rings, do, I can give you anything. And Paul says, he played this to John, and John said, oh, he didn't like the lyrics. And we had a deep, sad moment. Oh, they were sad that the song sucked. So they went off, have a cup of tea and a ciggy, and then they just have this idea, Drive My Car. And it comes back into the thing we said a minute ago. Paul, who knows how to pull the thread and write a song, says, well, if that's the idea, where does it go? So, you drive a car. Who's driving the car? Who's a chauffeur? Does he have the chauffeur? Does he have the money? And he suddenly turns into another one of these hilarious Rubber Soul joke songs.
It is a joke song. He says it was wonderful because this nice tongue-in-cheek idea came, and suddenly there was a girl, the heroine of the story, and the story had developed and had a little sting in the tail, like Norwegian Wood had, which was actually, I haven't got a car, but when I do get one, you'll be a terrific chauffeur. So to me, it was LA chicks. I'm not getting that. And also it meant you can be my lover. Drive my car is an old blues euphemism for sex. So in the end, all is revealed. Black humor crept in and saved the day.
I think it's very much a British kind of car song, because you have American rock and roll car songs where at the time, you get a car, everybody gets a car. Hands up who's 16 and wants a car, everyone gets one. Whereas in the UK, that was not the situation at all. So I think it's, if you're looking at it as a flip to, your Chuck Berrys or your Beach Boys type car songs, this is a Beatles British car song where it's like, well, actually, we don't have a car. Maybe someday we'll have a car. Who knows? Who needs a car anyway? I'm off to stand in the rain.
But the other thing is American car songs are about hot rods and motivating over the hill and with Chuck Berry and state troopers and Jersey turnpikes. Here, the big ambition is to have a car that somebody else will drive for you. That's it's not that the protagonist here wants to drive a car. It's that they want to be driven. That's the thing.
But yes, as you say, no doubt that Baby You Can Drive My Car is also a euphemism for the thing that most songs are a euphemism for as well. When they record it, it was the first Beatles session to go past midnight. Again, lots of things happen on Rubber Soul that become the norm. Remaking songs, working way into the night. And they managed to get one complete take after 4 tracks, which was, Paul on bass, George on Fender Strat, Ringo on drums, and maybe John on tambourine. We think John mightn't have played any instrument on this at all, potentially. And then they do the kind of the layering on all the vocals, Lennon's double track lines, Maybe I Love You. And the guitar solo, though, is Paul.
Yes, that's right. Why is that then, Jason?
And it's why is that?
Yes,
because he's so good.
That must be it.
It certainly has that. Once you know what you're looking for, he has a very attacking guitar style. So you can kind of hear it in Drive My Car. You hear it in Taxman, which is also a Paul solo. You hear it in Good Morning, which, as far as I know, is another Paul solo. So it's very. It just jumps out at you. It's not very measured or melodic like George would be.
Very controlling of Paul is what you're trying to say.
Well, I'm just saying
he has a fixed idea, and we'll hear George talk about this later in another context. But he's Paul comes in with absolutely everything. And we've talked about this before, where he can hear every aspect of the song. As a record, he can hear the record, not the song. He can actually hear the record. So he comes in and he says, "You do this, and you do this, and I'll do that, and then I'll do that, and you do that, and then I'll do this." And so he has a very set arrangement here. And the solo, he seems to have done it at least once, maybe twice, because you can hear that it's a slightly odd. If you put the headphones on, you can kind of hear maybe a bleed through from an earlier run through on the solo that sounds slightly odd.
Yeah, he's I guess if we're again looking for the parallels, George decided I'll play if you want, or I won't play if you don't want me to, whatever pleases you. So it pleased Paul to do the solo on Drive My Car, but once this is the first session that goes past midnight, then they're done. That's in the can. It doesn't get revisited, rewritten.
No.
Pretty swift, straightforward song and recording. So that's session 2 of Revolver done. We then get on to session 3, which is Saturday the 16th of October, and there's there's 2 songs that kind of get brought up here, which is one is Day Tripper, which is actually going to be the next single, and we get the first appearance of George's If I Needed Someone, which is a brief rehearsal. Now, Day Tripper gets hived off to be the next single, and it's not earmarked at all at any point for Rubber Soul. So it's not like where we're going to record a bunch of songs and see which one works as a single. Time is of the essence here. So they know that Day Tripper is the single. And it seems odd to us in the 21st century that they are not only trying to deliver a 14-track album for, a little over 8 weeks' time, but they're also trying to deliver a number 1 2-sided single, the first double A-side single in history. So good, it's got 2 A-sides. That's 16 original tracks. It's quite crazy.
It makes no sense. You think we're under pressure to deliver this album. So what's the best thing to do? Tell you what, we'll come in on a Saturday and record a separate single. Even at this point, they're not. They're not prepared to kind of hive off a couple of tracks from the album or put out as a single something. Drive My Car, I'm sure, would have been a good hit single.
Yeah, it could have been.
It just seems very odd that they do that. Of course, we talked about the double A side on our double A side episode.
We did indeed. So they spend it's a 9.5-hour recording session. They spend 8.5 hours getting Day Tripper down, and then they do an hour on George's debut of If I Needed Someone. And it's quite egalitarian when you look at it. We've had the John Day, we've had the Paul Day, and now we're going to get the single out of the way, and now it's George's turn. And If I Needed Someone, I think in terms of George bringing stuff to the studio, and we've touched upon this earlier in the episode, I think this is a great song. This is fantastic.
It is. I think it's a little bit too long, but I think it gets a little repetitive. But you say it's very egalitarian, but they just knocked off a single take backing track in an hour.
Well, they did. But then the next recording session 4, is on Monday, October the 18th. And here's where they give much more time to If I Needed Someone. So that's when, they give it a bit more attention. So when I say a bit more attention, it's another 3 hours. Everything's done in about 3 or 4 hours on this album.
But this is, if there's any song in the Beatles repertoire that betrays the influence of the Byrds, this is the one. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, they actually had attended a recording session by the Byrds. So this is when they had a few days off in LA, which was August 23rd to 27th during the 65 American tour. And at this point, it's worth remembering that Derek Taylor was the publicity agent for the Byrds. So I'm guessing Derek's hand was involved in setting that up. And they become quite sort of friendly with the Byrds, and David Crosby in particular and George seem to have hit it off. If you remember, David Crosby turns up at the Pepper Sessions and is the first human being to hear A Day in the Life, but he has confirmed again recently on Twitter he did not sing on that or any other track. But he and George were particularly friendly, and Crosby writes a song for George at one point later in the career. And but George actually sends an acetate when this is done, sends it to Roger McGuinn.
It is freaky how fast some of this stuff happens. So the Byrds' first single, I think, only comes out in about March of 65, Mr. Tambourine Man, which goes to number 1. And, it's only 6 weeks before recording If I Needed Someone that they are hanging out in LA with the Byrds, that they are absorbing this and how quickly they make decisions. Yes, this band is worthy of our attention, our respect, and off they go, recording this song. Is that meeting in August 65? Is that the one where John and George do LSD?
Yes, because they David Crosby comes out to their house. They're staying in Benedict Canyon Road, and Crosby comes out, and I think they all drop acid at that point, as you do.
That'd be a party and a half. So,
but yeah, George is very open even from the beginning. I mean, he tells the NME this is based on the 12-string figure from Bells of Rimini by the Byrds. And if you listen to those two songs side by side, someone cleverer than me could do a nice mashup of those two songs.
Well, maybe somebody out there can do it. It is the only George song that the Beatles put into their live set.
Yeah, go figure.
Yeah, I know.
I have to say those 66 live versions are terrible. Well, specifically the Tokyo version. It's one of those songs that they're just so tired.
I think if George was to pick a terrible version, he would pick the Hollies version.
It's not that bad.
I don't think it's that bad. I was quite surprised to see this quote. So, the Hollies actually put it out as a single, and I guess it must have been, it becomes a top 20 hit single, at the end of 1965. It actually comes out as a single on the same day as Rubber Soul, December the 3rd, and reached the top 20. So it must have been good for George's well, he might claim he didn't have an ego, but it might have been good for his spirit that he had written a top 20 single to see the song up the charts. But he was very disparaging on
it. And good for his bank balance as well, I imagine. But yeah, he's
yes.
You can hear him say this. He says, "I didn't write it for the Hollies. They've done it as their new single, but their version is not my kind of music." And he says, "I think it's rubbish the way they've done it." Yeah, they've spoilt it. They're all right musically, but the way they do their records, they sound just like session men who got together in a studio without ever seeing each other before. Technically they're good, but that's all. And you think, he's pinpointing that thing that I was saying about Drive My Car. It's about the feel, and it's about, there's just an intangible quality to the Beatles version.
Yes,
I have to say the Hollies version is better than the version on Live in Japan. Because it's just Eric Clapton just doing an Eric Clapton solo, and it's kind of weird.
And it is a song that live in Japan is just generally weird. George did sing the song at his National Law Party last UK gig in 1992. Tom Petty sang it at the concert for George. So it's a song that kind of hangs around and is basically, I think, George's first proper signature song.
I think so, and it's a good version by Tom Petty. Tom Petty does a good version. You can see that. I mean, Tom Petty is just, his entire career is lifted from the Byrds himself. So,
well, it's an intersection of the Byrds and George Harrison, so it's perfect for Tom Petty. And of course, don't forget the Hollies. Graham Nash goes off to meet David Crosby. It's all connected. It's all interlinked. But once we get past If I Needed Someone, we get onto one of the key tracks of Rubber Soul, which is In My Life. And again, another song where John and Paul are together, putting it together, and it's a bit of a disagreement about who did what.
Yes, I mean, they argue these things back and forth, but I think there are really only two Lennon-McCartney songs in the entire canon where there is a fundamental disagreement, really a major disagreement between the two of them. One is Eleanor Rigby and the other one is this one. Paul, I have to say, has been pretty consistent in his version. John had always described Paul's involvement as being fairly minimal, and he actually recounts the origins of the song back to an interview that he had done in March 1964, where this journalist, Kenneth Alsop, was sort of saying, you've written this book, it's kind of slightly off the wall, lyrics, that sort of wordplay, that sort of personal aspect of your writing doesn't turn up in the song. Why not? And he was thinking about that, and he said, why don't you put something of your childhood into the songs? So Lennon said, I wrote the lyrics first and then sang it. That was usually the case with things like In My Life and Across the Universe, some of the ones that stand out a bit. I wrote it in Kenwood, upstairs. It started out as a bus journey from my house at Menlove Avenue into town, mentioning every place I could remember. I wrote it all down, and it was ridiculous. It was the most boring sort of what I did on my holidays bus trip song, and it wasn't working at all. But then I just laid back, and these lyrics started coming to me about the places I remember. It came to me, letting go is the whole game. And that was Lennon speaking in 1980. But that is completely the opposite from Paul's take. So
yes, well, Paul, we do actually have the original draft poem, because Elliot Mintz, who worked with Yoko on John's personal possessions, found it in a book. Shall I read the original poem?
Please do.
Cough, cough, cough. There are places I'll remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, but not for better. Some have gone and some remain. So that's familiar. Penny Lane is one I'm missing. Up church and to the clock tower. In the circle of the Abbey, I have seen some happy hours. Past the tram sheds with no trams. On the number 5 bus into town. Past the Dutch and St. Columbus. To the Dockers umbrella that they pulled down. All these places have their memories. Some are dead and some are living. So it's a bit sixth form in parts.
I was going to say it's a bit sixth formish.
It needs more trams. There's not enough trams mentioned, or buses, or any sorts, more vehicles.
Yeah,
these are vehicles in my vehicle.
In my vehicle. Paul talked about this in November of 1965 for the NME. He said the song was about a number of the places in Liverpool where we were born. Places like Penny Lane, the Dockers umbrella, have a nice sound, but when we strung them together in a composition, they sounded contrived. So we gave up. So were they just kind of talking? Do we put a lot of emphasis on the use of the word "we" there, or not? But
or is it a Royal Beatles "we"? Yeah,
I think it's a Royal Beatles "we." So supposedly Paul says that John premiered this poem, and this is the point at which the discrepancies start. John said, "There's a period when I thought I don't really write melodies. Paul writes those. I write straight shouting rock and roll. But of course, when I think of some of my own songs in my life, I was writing melody with the best of them." John did say that Paul helped with the middle 8, but he says the lyrics were already written before Paul had even heard it, and his contribution melodically was the harmony and the middle 8 itself. It was my first real major piece of work. Up until then, it had been all glib and throwaway. But this is completely different from what Paul sets out.
Paul says, he says, my memories of writing in my life, I arrived at John's house for a writing session and he had the very nice opening stanzas for the songs. But as I recall, he didn't have a tune to it. And my recollection is, I think, at variance with John's. So he's acknowledging that he doesn't agree with John. I said, well, if you haven't a tune, just let me go and work at it. And I went down to the half landing where John had a mellotron and put together a tune based in my mind on Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, songs like You've Really Got a Hold of Me and Tears of a Clown. So I recall writing the whole melody. And actually, it does sound very like me. It's interesting that Paul can recognize his own melodies if you analyze it. I was obviously working to lyrics. The melody structure is very me. So my recollection is saying to John, let's go have a cup of tea or something. Let me be with this for 10 minutes and I'll do it. But as usual for these coding things, he often just had the first verse, which was always enough. So this is another version of the story where it's interesting. John says, I wrote this poem and then I just went off and lied down and tried to get inspiration to come to me. And Paul is saying his Paul version of writing a song. I've got the first verse. And the first verse story is in keeping with that poem, because the first verse of that poem is In My Life. So that does make sense. And then that Paul says, actually, if you're someone who knows how to write a song, which I am, I'm Paul, I'm going to write a song out of this. and away he goes. So
yes, I think Paul's version here has the ring of truth. And to be fair, he's been pretty consistent. 1973 interview, he was asked what his favourite Lennon-McCartney song were, and he said, "I liked In My Life. Those were words that John wrote, and I wrote the tune to it." And then in 2001, he said, "I think I wrote it, but John thinks he wrote it. So you know what? He can have it. 1 out of 200." But I do think, to be fair to Paul, and obviously I don't like to be fair to Paul. I do think his version has the ring of truth.
Well, we could always ask the fun police, Ian MacDonald, who says, he talks about the song's angular verticality, spanning an octave in typically wide and difficult leaps, which certainly shows off McCartney's touch more than Lennon's. But on the other hand, the chromatic descent via the minor subdominant in the second half of the verse suggests Lennon, keep me awake, Stephen. Perhaps McCartney did the first half of the verse and then in the second it there. I made it to the end of the sentence. Thanks, Ian.
So we can say MacDonald. So we're going to say it's a co-write. It's a definite co-write, and Paul deserves.
I think we're saying it's a co-write. If I had my bell, I would ring it. But we're still on the fourth recording session for Rubber Soul, which is when it gets put down. It's a rhythm track with John on electric rhythm guitar, George on lead guitar riffs, Paul on bass, Ringo on drums. They keep take 3, and then they overdub John's vocals with some double tracking. Ringo adds a tambourine. And then they left the solo session blank, and John suggests to George Martin, why don't you look after that? And it's a classic. It's the George Martin classic. Here he comes, boys. I'm going to nip in. Going to do a bit of sped up piano. Don't mind me. And so he does do that 4 days later on October the 22nd, before the band get into the studio on that day, and he plays this Elizabethan solo, which is a double speed piano solo, which he just kind of does on his own accord.
Yeah, and you can hear that.
Do you like that solo?
I do like that solo.
I don't mind that solo. I know some people have a huge problem with it, that it kind of is a bit jarring, but I do like it.
I do like it. It kind of fits with that slightly wistful, nostalgic aspect to it. And I've heard the bootlegs of this session, and you can hear the normal speed piano, and it doesn't sound like anything. It actually sounds almost as if I could play it. It's and you think, again, this is George Martin able to hear this in his mind, what this is going to sound like. And he did tinker about with a sort of organ solo, like a Hammond organ solo, at the end of the session. But that was replaced. And you think that when they say Hammond organ solo, I'm thinking something really cheesy like Mr. Moonlight, that kind of thing. So no, I'm perfectly happy. Perfectly happy with this. And
he plays it down an octave, and when it's sped up, it's at the right speed. But the other thing that speeding up does when you're dealing with tape is it kind of gives a nice tone compression to the sound as well. So it sounds quite tart, and it's very good. And it becomes In My Life, the song we all know and love. And I think it is an important Lennon song. I'm thinking of the 1988 Imagine John Lennon film, where it kind of has a very important key presence in it, and it also has a key presence right at the start of Beatles anthology. It's perhaps the first Beatles song we hear in full. It kind of gives this kind of overview before we launch into the whole anthology story. It's quite affecting.
I think December 1980 gives it a resonance that perhaps it didn't have up to that point. But having said that, this is the Beatles didn't play this live, but this is the song that George chose for his 1974 live tour to do a Beatles song in a wonderful, terrible, awful, wretched version of this song. I don't know what he was thinking.
In My Life, I love God more.
Yeah. Well, I can
Isn't that what he sings?
I can see what he was thinking there, but I why he felt the need to do that, I don't know. The only version worse is Sean Connery's spoken word version. If you ever, I don't recommend people looking at that up on YouTube, but we will put up a link.
Well, yeah, and it's worth remembering, folks. John Lennon writes this memory song when he's 25 years of age. But there is also a kind of a theme in the song of, they realize that fame has not just geographically taken them away, but it's, in terms of how they're able to exist, taken them away from the people who they were.
Yeah. And I mean, he's talking about people who are no longer in his life. So you're thinking, it's logically he's talking about his mother, he's talking about Stuart Sutcliffe. So for somebody at 25, he has had a lot of loss in his life.
Yep.
And this is, I suppose, the first overt referencing back to childhood.
And, with no good idea being left unused, I think the germ for Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever starts with this song as well. This notion that you can pull things out from your past that, that actually their own childhood and Liverpool itself has as much value as a source of inspiration as, I don't know, the Black Mountain Hills of Dakota or the West Coast of LA or whatever it is, that it starts with this song here.
Yes, I think that's right.
So as we leave this, it is now Monday, the 18th of October. It is all the first week of recording of Rubber Soul. And so far in the can is Run for Your Life, Drive My Car, If I Needed Someone, In My Life, and a version of Norwegian Wood. But we're going to leave it there, and we're going to rejoin the rollicking adventures of the Beatles trying to get Rubber Soul over the line in late 65 and all the other things that impinge on their time in the next episode of Nothing Is Real. We remain available in all the usual places. www.nothingisrealpod.com is the website. That's the gateway to all the stuff. Twitter, at Beatles Pod, the Nothing Is Real Facebook group, all the Instagram stuff, all the TikToks and all the rest are all available there. And don't forget, we've got bonus episodes and all sorts of ad-free treats over on Acast Plus subscribers. If you subscribe on our It's All Too Much tier, there's a whole bunch of Nothing Is Real episodes over there exclusively for subscribers. But for now, I'm Jason Carty.
I'm Stephen Cockcroft.
And this has been Nothing Is Real. Thanks for listening.